Hello, I'm Alistair Upton. I'm the Chief Executive Creative Folkestone, and I'd like to welcome you here today to Autumn Reads Modern Nature. This is our virtual festival in which we're bringing you a range of activities based around the diaries that Derek Jarman wrote at Prospect Cottage 1989 to 1990. We do hope you enjoy the festival, and we'd like to thank you for your continued support of Creative Folkestone.
Good evening. My name is Stephen Gale, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to Autumn Reads, presented by Folkestone Book Festival this evening. This is, as you've just heard, a programme of events complementing Derek Jarman's classic book, Modern Nature. I'm especially delighted to introduce our guest this evening, Melissa Harrison. Melissa is a novelist and nature writer. She contributes a monthly nature column to the Times newspaper and writes for the FT Weekend, The Guardian, and The New Statesman. She's published 3 novels to date: Clay, At Hawthorne Time, and most recently, All Among the Barley, which was the UK winner of the European Union Prize for Literature, a Waterstones Paperback of the Year, and a Book of the Year in The Observer, The New Statesman, and The Irish Times. Melissa's also published a work of non-fiction, Rain, which was longlisted for the Wainwright Prize. She's now published this really fantastic book, The Stubborn Light of Things, a Nature Diary, which is a compilation of her nature notebook column in the Times. It's a beautifully written account of engaging with nature, both in the city and in the countryside, in evocative and precise prose, and covers the period from August 2014 to May 2020. And The Stubborn Light of Things is also the title of her popular podcast, which she began presenting in April 2020. We're going to make sure there's some time for questions at the end, if anybody would like to ask anything. But first of all, please welcome Melissa. It's lovely to speak to you.
Thank you very much. Hi, Stephen. It's good to see you.
And you, and you. I wanted to start, I suppose the obvious thing to start, if I can, is just to ask you a little about how your interest in nature writing evolved. You say at the beginning, in the introduction of the book, you didn't think you would ever qualify as a nature writer. And I was intrigued in particular by your use of the word qualify. Could you, in answering that, just tell us a little about your interest in nature writing?
I think I thought that you needed to be an expert. And for me, that meant a botanist or a zoologist or an ornithologist or somebody like that.
Yeah.
I didn't think that just having an interest was enough. I knew that I was a good noticer, someone who's very curious. And I knew that I could write well descriptively about nature. I'd been told as much by a primary school teacher, who, Mrs. Jessett, who, looking back, you know, it was one of the best things anyone did for me. She kept me back after class and told me that something I'd written was really good. And I could tell by the way she said it that she really meant it. It wasn't just a sort of, here, have a gold star. She really wanted me to hear that. But I didn't think that was a job, you know, writing descriptively about nature. And then when I started to read modern nature writing, I began to realise that there were people who were being paid to do this for a living, and not all of them were ologists at all. You know, there are people like Kathleen Jamie and Robert Macfarlane who were writing these beautiful works. You know, there was also Mark Cocker, who I read very early, but he is an expert ornithologist. And so I began to think maybe it might be possible, but I still didn't really know how to do it. I was living in London and I thought that disqualified me as well. I remember I submitted a piece to the Guardian Country Diary column, And they said, it's very nice, but you live in a city and it's a country diary. Fair enough. But I thought, well, 87% of us or something do. And we're surrounded by nature. And, I was fishing around really for how I could do this. And in the end, I wrote a novel. I thought I would take all of this that I want to say about my feeling for the natural world and what I think it can give us and what I think we can give it. And I'll use storytelling and characters and plot to try and to get it across to people and to help people engage with it. And I wrote this sort of weird hybrid, part sort of nature novel. I think it was called, or an urban pastoral. I think it was also used to describe it. And really, I'm glad now that I did, because I didn't think I could. I wasn't. I don't know. I look back on this time now, and I really wasn't very confident. I didn't think I could be a novelist either, because I didn't think I had lots of stories. I had this descriptive stuff I wanted to write, but I wasn't someone who's overflowing with plot or characters. And actually, it turned out I could write novels, and it turned out I could write about nature. And so, here I am, and I'm still not an expert, and I'm quite. That's one of the things I wanted to do in this book, is to tell people you don't have to learn to identify every single bird. You don't have to become someone who can pick out wildflowers. You can find your own way into nature in your own way, and it be incredibly rewarding. And you can teach yourself. 10 years ago, I couldn't recognize that many bird songs, and now I can, but not because there's something different about me, but because I taught myself. I went from being able to recognize maybe a blackbird and a magpie to being able to do most of what you would hear in a town garden, and now in the countryside around me. Still can't do shorebirds, waders, can't do gulls, but that's fine. I might get there and I might not. But it's a process of learning, and we can still do that as adults. I think it's easy to forget.
Can I just ask you a very sort of brass tacks question? What do you think are the factors that inform or influence our view of what constitutes nature?
That's a very good question, because we're living in this time of the coronavirus, which is also nature.
Yeah.
And there's a great Kathleen Jamie essay where she talks about looking at cells, looking at looking at pathology through a microscope, and seeing that these are living beings in a natural environment, and it being this really challenging moment of yes, that is nature too. Nature is viruses, and it is cancer, and it is all sorts of things which we would quite like to imagine it isn't. And it's us too. And I don't mean that in a way, that's sometimes said to me as a way of excusing our behavior, like, well, we're nature, so we can do what we like. We are nature, but we're also incredibly powerful. So that comes with responsibilities. But yes, we are nature too, and that's important to remember. Not everything we make and do is natural, but we are.
You say quite early on in the book that you say that nature is often presented. It's like a sort of a binary way that it's presented, either as an obstacle or as a luxury. Could you just talk a bit about that?
Yeah. And this comes of this really anthropocentric, so human-centered view that we have of the world, that we are the main players on the stage, and everything else is sort of backdrop.
Yeah.
It's just sort of been put here for us to do stuff with, or to ignore, or to, despoil, or to use for profit or whatever. But everything exists in relation to us. And of course, that isn't the case. And when you start to realize that, it can be very challenging to realize that we are one amongst many creatures, all of whom have, their own rights and their own priorities, which may or may not include us. I find it incredibly liberating. I love living in a world where I am not just a subject, but I'm also an object to other creatures. That I find hugely relaxing. There was a book I loved when I was a child called A Black Fox Running, which is about foxes on Dartmoor. And it was revolutionary because it has human characters and animal characters. And if you don't like books with talking animals, it may not be for you, but I think it's done beautifully. And you see both the human lives and their priorities and the lives of the animals weighed equally in both hands. And that just changed my thinking really enormously as a child. But also, I think there's this idea that it's a very dangerous idea that nature is something that you get in the car to go and see. So you go to a nature reserve, or you go to a national park, and there's the nature, and then you come back and go home. And the danger of that view is that what it leads to is a feeling that as long as you can preserve it there, you can do whatever you like everywhere else. So we just corral it and we put it in a zoo, and then we've still got the nature. We've got the Lake District, that's fine, got Dartmoor. The rest doesn't really matter. And of course, that doesn't work. So we need to understand that nature is our street trees and our gardens and our window boxes and our brownfield sites and our ex-industrial sites, which may not look pretty. And we also need to think about the way that farmland, which may look like nature to us and may look green and beautiful and tick all of our bucolic boxes, maybe, and in a lot of cases, is almost completely devoid of life. And there's a truism, I'm trying to think who it was that said it, it's conservationist, tip of my tongue, but he said the best thing you can do with intensively farmed agricultural land is build a housing estate on it.
Really?
Because the moment you do that, you will have more nature. Because the way that people garden recreates something called ecotones, which are the borders between habitats, which are incredibly rich in life. So the banks of rivers, the edges of woods, the margins of fields, that's where things live. And that's what we create with gardens. So the moment you do that, you can turn an ecological wasteland that looks green and pleasant into something that's rich and full of life.
It's fascinating when you're in the book, when you're talking about the first half of the book, you're still living in the city, living in London. Of course, you're describing all this nature around you on the streets of, and I confess I had never previously considered the Streatham High Road to be a sort of ecological wilderness, but you convinced me.
Europe's longest high street, and isn't it Europe's ugliest as well? It was voted Europe's ugliest.
I was very surprised, though, that you say that London is one of the greenest cities in Europe. That genuinely surprised me. Is that just because we have a lot of parks? Why is that?
A lot of parks. Also, in this country, we do garden with a degree of focus and attention that doesn't always happen in other parts of the world. It's a cultural thing.
Yeah.
There's a lot of water in London. The Thames has been cleaned up. We have seahorses breeding in the Thames. People think of it as dead. It was declared biologically dead back in the late 60s, I think, early 70s, but it's now returning to there are still problems, but it is, we've got harbour porpoises, we've got seahorses, we've got all sorts of fish. It is a living thing. There was a dead otter found in central London not that long ago. Means that there was an otter there. I'd quite like to see a live one, but this is happening. It is an extraordinary place.
The Thames, you describe this really well in the book. The Thames is a relative success story. It's something we might have given up on, actually, as you say, come back to life. But why? I think you make the point that if you ask most people about the Thames, they would tell you it's dirty and polluted and disgusting. And that's to do with projecting their feelings onto it, I think, is the point you're making.
Yeah, well, it's a silty river, so it looks brown, so that, it has that, as a demerit. And also, I think we do this. And we do it with animals as well, and it really gets my goat. So there's a lot of creatures that can live alongside us in cities, and these are generally creatures that are very like us. So rats, squirrels, these are pigeons. These are clever, they're adaptable, they are brave, they're numerous. They behave in ways that are very close to us, and we hate them. We hate them for it. And we project onto them our own disgust and our own numerousness and our own wastefulness and our own behaviour. So when people talk about, having seen a pigeon eating something disgusting off the pavement, who was it that put the disgusting thing there? It's us. They're there in numbers because they're like us and because of our behaviour. But the moment we do that, the moment we call something a pest or vermin, we other it. We say, well, that's not wildlife. That's a special category. And now we can do what we like to it. And, you look at a bird like the passenger pigeon, which we wiped out within a single generation. And it was the most numerous bird in the world. So, we shouldn't be complacent about our ability to, starlings used to be everywhere in London, and now you barely see 10 together. So we need to cherish these things that we think of as pests because they can go really quickly. We're about to lose hedgehogs, and everyone loves hedgehogs.
You were lucky when living in London. You did have a garden.
I didn't at first for many years. My first flat was in Dalston, and it was had a steel-lined front door. It was above a car dealership, and there were no trees anywhere that I could see from the flat or on my bus route in and back to work. So I didn't see any trees at all. And then I lived in a succession of flats after that without a garden. And finally, moved in with my husband at the time, and we had a little garden. We got a dog, and getting a dog meant walking the dog, and walking the dog meant getting out and discovering places to walk the dog every day. And so suddenly I was finding these little corners. Some of them were big parks, and some were, there was one that was the garden of an old Victorian villa that had been torn down after the Second World War, and it still had parts of the villa and foundations and some Victorian planting from the garden. There was a larch, rhododendrons, and I never would have gone there otherwise, and it became a favorite spot. And when you connect with a place daily over time and you see it change and you remember it year on year, and you can say, oh, the bird cherry's there's not as much as there was last year. Do you remember why are the bees nesting over there this year? Well, and you suddenly develop this depth of connection with a place, and that can happen in the heart of a city. That doesn't have to be a country bucolic thing. And I miss that. I miss London still.
Yeah. How in a city like London, how wild can nature be? Inevitably, you talk at one point about at certain times of the year, council employees will come along and clean the pavements and things like this. Is there a sort of a compromise that needs to be made, or do you think it should be left wilder than it perhaps is?
It's really hard at the moment because there's sort of swinging budget cuts. That's actually helping a lot of councils to leave parks alone a little bit more because they just don't have the budget.
Yeah.
But people need recreation areas. They need somewhere that the kids can go and kick around a football, and so it does need mowing. I'm not somebody that's saying we have to rewild everywhere and we have to leave. And also managing certain environments for nature does take quite a lot of input. So if you want to keep an area sown with native wildflowers, you are going to need to mow, and you're going to need to mow at a certain time of year, and you're going to need to take away the cuttings, and you might need to sow yellow rattle, and you might need to do all sorts of things. So, it's not a case of just walk away and leave it. Yeah. And people's needs need to be taken into account, but people's prejudices are a different matter. And sometimes people just, there's some habit. Sometimes people just think things should be very tidy, and that's what looks right. That's what you've grown up thinking looks right, rather than understanding that an unmown area might be buzzing with grasshoppers, and that's a lovely thing. You might not even have noticed there were grasshoppers in it. So that, we can't just click our fingers and have everyone, change their mindset overnight. Oh. But hopefully, I think, I'm seeing more and more stories about wildflower verges and people really wanting to see things like that. And I think we are, really think we are changing. I think we are.
Yeah, it goes back to what you're saying just now about that sort of abrogation of responsibility. You can drive to the countryside, you can drive, but the city remains tidy and pristine.
Yeah, when I go into the city now, I often stay at the Barbican, and I noticed I got in a couple of times between lockdowns, and there are no swifts over the square mile at all. So there's swifts I would see in all other parts of London, but they're not there because there's no insects. And there's no insects because there's no plants. So, that we could have more nature if we expected it to be there, and if we changed the way that we were looking after that part of London, there'd be swifts overhead. Having said that, there were peregrine falcons, so eating the pigeons.
There's a lovely chapter in the book where you're very protective of these. There's a bird's nest in the garden, and you're very protective of these baby birds, and you're standing guard to make sure that predators don't come in. So on. In the context of that sort of feeling that you have, that protectiveness, could I ask you, in terms of our relationship with nature, what does stewardship mean to you?
Well, it's really interesting, because a lot of what I have been trying to do in the book is question myself and question other people in terms of the assumptions that we have.
Yeah.
And when I had the great tits in my bird box, I absolutely wanted them to fledge, even though I know that were they to be eaten by the local sparrowhawk, that is just fine, and that's how it goes. Obviously, I would never harm the local sparrowhawk, but I didn't want to see them taken as they were fledging. But then I went to stay in Suffolk when I was writing my last novel, and I stayed in an Airbnb with a large garden, and the woman owner was very proud of the garden and showed me around. And on the lawn, she had 2 Larsen Traps, and Larsen Traps are cages in which a live bird is used to attract another bird in, which is, you then kill the call bird and you swap, and the next one becomes the bait to bring more in. And this was for magpies. And I was very surprised, because Larsen Traps are usually, they're not something you use in private gardens. They can be used by landowners. And she said, I've got blue tits, and they're my blue tits, and I'm not seeing them taken by magpies. And this was really interesting, because she had created a goodie and a baddie out of 2 native bird species, neither of which are in any way endangered. There's no problems with numbers, but she was going to step in and actually kill a native bird in favour of another. So stewardship is a really tricky one.
Yeah.
It can end up being something, and she knew as well that she wasn't going to have an impact on magpie numbers. All that would happen is another magpie would move into that territory. But in her domain, she wanted to be responsible for what happened in it. And I recognise that, because I did the same. I would never harm the sparrowhawk, but I didn't want it to eat in my garden. And we have to be careful with that. We have to be really careful about the fact that it's really easy not to see the bigger picture, and our impulse to make goodies and baddies, and especially as that affects the idea of native and non-native. Because you can end up, I remember, I think it was last spring, there was a news story about fears that myxomatosis had jumped from rabbits to hares. And this would be a disaster if it happened. And I was tweeting about it, and a naturalist replied and said, "What's the problem? They're not native anyway." And I thought, God, okay, so this is an animal the brown hare has been here for thousands of years, and it's well loved. It's filled an ecological niche. We've got a huge amount of culture and folklore attached to it. That doesn't matter to you because it's not native. Also, the suffering of all of those individual animals wouldn't matter because it's not native. And again, this comes from the idea of our domain. So we're going to put a fence around Great Britain or the UK and decide what should and shouldn't be here, taking I don't know what date, and leaving aside the idea that lots of things would have found their way here anyway, because things do. So it's crazy and it's dangerous. Little owls. Do we want to get rid of little owls because they're not native, brought here by the Victorians? I don't think we do. No. So it's not the measure to judge by when we're doing conservation. No goodies and baddies, and no us and them.
Oh, you talk at one point. You're talking about frost. Frost is natural for the animals and the creatures that are native here. Then it's not an issue. You need the frost. It's the ones that have come in, perhaps, that might struggle with the frost. But presumably they adapt.
They will over time. Yes. Yeah. I mean, and it's such a complex picture. So we've got climate change happening at the moment, which is obviously not a good thing. Some things are going to do well out of it. So Orthoptera, grasshoppers and crickets are thought to be doing well because it's creating more of the conditions in which they're happy to live. Change is a constant and we can't hold it back. Obviously, that's by no means being an apologist for climate change, but we can't hold things in stasis, particularly with these big changes and these big forces going on. What we need to be able to do is have some flexibility in the way that we look after our landscape, and projects like the NEP project in Sussex, creating dynamic habitats that are able to change and able to respond in their own way, that's the approach we need, I think.
You mentioned just now about taking an Airbnb and moving to Suffolk to write, and I thought we might talk a bit now about the countryside section of the book, but I wondered before that if I could invite you if you'd like to read a little first.
Yes. So I moved. It wasn't a sort of simple thing. I came to stay in Suffolk several times when I was writing the book, and then I rented a cottage and moved here in 2017 in the depths of winter, December it was, and then I moved from that village to where I am now. And this piece is from November last year. Yeah. So I had just moved into this village. I've come to a place of extraordinary silence. Having lived in rural Suffolk for the last 2 years, I thought I knew quiet, but now I've bought my first house, a cottage 4 miles north in a village significantly further from any main roads, and the difference is astonishing. I didn't consciously notice any traffic noise at my old place, but it must have been there because now, if I wake at night, the silence feels as though it's actively pressing on my ears. Lying in pitch blackness, we have no streetlights, utterly deprived of sensory input, is strangely disquieting. Yet the constant hum of background noise is a very recent development. For most of our history, total silence and total darkness would have been nothing unusual at all. This new quietness has made me more aware of sound, from the mysterious creature that processes across my roof each night, to the rain gurgling relentlessly in the gutters and the noise the wind makes as it rushes through the last of the ash leaves, tattered and yellowing. The writer John Lewis Stemple can tell which part of his wood he's walking through at night by the differing sounds of the leaves overhead. Here, in my silent village, I'm beginning to understand how that might be. The particular whisper of their pinnate leaves and their flickering, watery shade pattern are among the less remarked on losses that will attend the possible disappearance of ash trees from our countryside as Chalara dieback takes hold. Sound is such a vital part of our relationship with nature, and yet, apart from birdsong, it's so easily overlooked. Walking with me on Dartmoor last month, my sister Joelle pointed out the hollow thud boots make on fine turf set over dry peat. Similarly, there's a clashing sound that comes from walking on wet granite gravel that feels entirely particular to the moor. I wouldn't have said that I could actively hear my dog Scout's footfalls, yet I'm instantly alerted to the fact that she's seen a squirrel or a cat by the sudden silence of her steps. You can look away from something you're not interested in, but you can't listen away. Noises are taken in and processed regardless. We have an auditory relationship with the natural world that persists despite our modern lack of attention to it. Tuning in to sound is a deeply atavistic pleasure. Once more, the spindles are revealing themselves. Stumbling on one deep in a drab winter wood is enough to bring one up short, the combination of fuchsia and flame so exotic as to seem decidedly un-British, although in fact a spindle is a native tree. The wood of Euonymus europaeus is hard, close-grained and grows straight, making it ideal for winding thread without breaking or catching. It also creates charcoal so smooth as to be prized by artists. Its fruit, bark and leaves were once used to treat lice and nits, and as a purgative. Despite its long history here, the 16th century herbalist William Turner could find no local names for it, but noted that the Dutchmen call it in Netherland spilboom, that is spindle tree, because they used to make spindles of it in that country, and methink it may be as well named in English, seeing we have no other name. Dusk is my favourite time to go out walking. As the light fades, the night shift clocks on. Rabbits come out to feed. Owls call from the copses and spinneys, and foxes, deer, hedgehogs and badgers can sometimes be seen. In summer, bats begin hunting as darkness falls, and in spring there's the evening chorus to serenade you, almost as joyful and riotous as at dawn. As the human world quietens down, it can feel as though the natural world wakes up. But there's another reason I love to be out of doors at day's end. Here in Suffolk, traces of the past are everywhere, from horse ponds glinting like mercury among the stubble fields to labourers' cottages like mine, with wood smoke curling from brick chimneys hundreds of years old. In the half-light of dusk, the old lanes empty of traffic, it's possible to leave behind the present day with its frightening uncertainties and enter a world in which heavy horses work the land, the seasons turned with comforting regularity, and climate change was unheard of. Political and social nostalgia may be dangerous, but ecologically it's unavoidable. At dusk, if only briefly, one can imagine that the world is still unharmed.
That's lovely. Thank you very much. Thank you. It's a lovely choice to choose something from this time of year. It's a good choice.
Good.
You mentioned at the beginning, as you were introducing the piece, that you have moved within Suffolk since you moved. And I was fascinated when you opened this piece here. You're talking about you thought you'd encountered silence where you lived before in the rented cottage, and then you moved to this cottage, and this idea of like gradations of silence. Fascinating.
It really is extraordinary. The other cottage was fairly near the A12, but not a stone's throw. But it must have just been there in the background all the time. And of course, in London, it's never really silent. There's always cars or planes or the underground rumbling away under your feet. And here, it really feels like an artifact, the silence at night. It's extraordinary. And I remember at the beginning of lockdown, it was, even in the daytime, I'd go out for my walks and there was nothing at all, just nothing apart from the birds. And I heard the traffic start up again at the end of lockdown. I heard as I went out, you could start to hear in the daytime. Nighttime, it's still silent.
And presumably no artificial light.
No, the stars here are breathtaking on a starry night. I mean, it's hard to pick out the familiar constellations because there are so many stars. It's wonderful. I love it.
How did you alight on Suffolk? I mean, because your background, your history is childhood visits. I mean, you grew up in Surrey.
I did.
You more to Dartmoor, which you mentioned in that reading, and to the Lake District, which seem to be quite different terrain.
No, I know. I thought I would end up in an upland landscape if I left London. I thought I'd go to the moorlands, and then I was writing All Among the Barley and coming out here and researching it, and I just fell in love with it. It's somewhere, I think, partly because of its geography. The Orwell Crossing was opened in early 80s, and there was a lot of Suffolk that was just really quite inaccessible. And I had an AA book of walks, and it's got nothing in East Anglia at all. It's divided up into different parts of the country, and walks in the West Country and Scotland and the Midlands and the South East. And East Anglia just doesn't exist for the AA. And, this was, I think it's 1979 that was published. And so I think partly because of that, and partly because it had a wool boom in the 1400s, and then there was a bust, and wool trade disappeared. And I think people didn't have the money to do over their houses. So it's got a huge number of very, very old farms and labourers' cottages, which, are still standing and haven't been modernised. And I love that. I love the fact that I had a chance to live in somewhere really old, somewhere with witch marks carved into the beams, that kind of thing.
Now, your story in the book, it's not a sort of a cliched city dweller moves to rural idyll thing at all, because your interest in nature is long before that. That said, you did move, and so what for you are the significant changes that have taken place for you since you moved to the countryside, and what things are the same, for that matter?
I think one of the big ones has been my relationship with the people around me.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's something a lot of people struggle with if you've come from a city to the countryside, and in reverse, because there are different ways of being polite in both places. So in the city, to be polite, you ignore your neighbours. So you pretend that you didn't hear them having a screaming argument last night, or that you didn't see the amount of wine bottles outside their gate in the morning. To get on with people in a small space, you all just pretend, you just give each other loads of space.
Yeah.
And in the countryside, the way to be polite is to show an interest and to offer help and support. And that can be weird if you're not used to it. And in the village I first moved to, I moved there without a car, and I knew nobody at all. And it was December. I didn't know where to buy wood. Wasn't very good at lighting the wood burner. I was walking 1.5 miles back to and from the station at night, because it would always be dark. My train got in at 8:45. And my neighbours, there was wood left on my doorstep. People came to meet my train. People arrived with a loaf of bread and some milk in case I didn't have any food in. And I opened myself to that kindness.
Yeah.
Because I had to, but also because I just thought I'm not going to be one of these people that moves to the countryside, to a small village, and then keeps themselves entirely to themselves and doesn't make any friends. I won't survive that way, and that's not who I want to be. But it was a big mental shift, because the reason someone left wood or came to meet my train is because they looked at, they'd been able to see my wood store from the road and saw that it was empty. And they noticed which train I got. And that can feel weird if you're not used to it, that people are noticing. That
Yes.
can feel, it's why people in cities think that people in the countryside are nosy, and it's why people in the countryside think people in the city are unfriendly. But they're just different ways to be. So that was a big shift. Yeah.
You mentioned at the beginning that you were a noticer. Have you learned to notice more that other people's woodsheds are empty and that sort of thing now?
Well, it's been a strange year, hasn't it?
Yeah.
And I'm still new to the village, and so I've been trying to work out how helpful I can be, and what help is already being offered, and trying to work out who I might be able to be responsible for and who I shouldn't be responsible for. So I've been doing some shopping for some people in the village and in my old village. and trying to work out what the bonds are and who's, how it all works really, which is hard without being able to, there was no village fete this year, no meetings in the village hall. So I'm trying.
Yeah. There's a lovely, it's just a passing reference in one of the chapters. You're talking about something else, but just in passing, you refer to a Saturday afternoon group litter collection. You're collecting. I was surprised there was any litter, I have to admit, but I love the idea of just everybody just going out on Saturday afternoon picking up litter.
Yes, we used to do that in my last village, and because I was doing that off my own bat anyway when I was walking backwards and forwards to the station, and I used to take a bin bag and just fill it up, take it to the station, put it in the bin. And I'm not talking about the people in my village, but a couple of times people would drive past me and it was quite discomforting to people. A couple of times I had people stop and say, there's no point you doing that. You won't get it all. I'm like, well, I know. It's still better if I get some. And someone stopped and said, oh, you're making me feel bad that I don't do it. And I said, well, you could start. And I think we have this impulse. I've been seeing it a bit with Marcus Rashford, that when somebody does something, it can challenge us as to why we're not doing something. And then the easiest thing to get rid of the discomfort is to shoot them down. And then I found out about the village litter pick and I joined in with that, and that was all a lot easier. But it's people throwing things out of car windows. Makes me very
okay. So it's not the locals, it's just people.
No, it's not. It's never the locals. No, it's lorry drivers.
Yeah.
And lots of masks I'm seeing at the moment, which is not good.
There's a piece I found incredibly moving. I was really moved by this when I read this. If I remember correctly, you're walking across the fields to the next village. You're heading somewhere. It's quite a long walk. And you make the observation that animals and humans will follow the same path across an open field. I find this very moving, actually. Could you tell me a little about that?
I see it all the time. So across an open field, when it's ploughed, the paths disappear, the rights of way disappear. Yeah. And then, someone will have to be the first. And then after a few days, the dog walkers will have the path back and you can see it across the field. And in that soil, so around you, the soil has been turned over and it's very ploughed. And then, you end up with a sort of flatter bit where people have walked. And in that, you will see the slots of deer heading in along the same line. And I see it a lot with badger scat. So badgers will mark the edges of their territory with a line of latrines. They'll dig a little hole, do a very black, runny, smelly poo in it, which I always love to see. And they often use paths, human paths, as the edges of their territories. Oh. And foxes as well. So foxes like to do their poos up high often. So they do it on your rubbish if you leave it outside your gate. On a molehill, but sometimes you get fox poos along the line of a path as well. And, the idea that, some human paths may have started off as animal tracks as well. Places like Dartmoor, if you get lost in a bog, your best bet is to follow the sheep path because the sheep know, they're not going to get stuck in a bog. So some of these paths might have started off, when I think back to history, they might have started off as an animal path, become a human path. Now they're an animal path again. Some of them could be, many, many, many hundreds, thousands of years old even.
Yeah.
Some of them are just made by the local dog walkers, but,
Now, we've got questions coming in, so I'll give you a couple of the questions that have been sent in to us. Okay, this is the first one. This is really good. Walter Benjamin described attentiveness as the natural prayer of the soul.
Lovely.
Do you see attentiveness as an intrinsic part of our engagement with nature?
That's lovely.
Yeah, it's really great, isn't it?
I'm writing this down, Walter Benjamin. Sorry. That's great. Yes. Yes, I do. And to each other as well. I think to attend to each other in terms of noticing the separate life of another being, whether that's a human or the non-human, is the greatest action we can take towards it, actually, because it pays it the compliment of being self-willed and important and precious. And to try, because you're always going to fail, but to try to move through the world in a way that has at its heart that kind of attentiveness to the rest of the world, that's what I aspire to, because from that comes love, I think. Or from that can come love. It doesn't always. And from love comes care.
That's a lovely answer. Thank you. Here's another question. Has the move to Suffolk changed your perception of yourself?
Of myself? I'm still working that out. When I moved to Suffolk, the plan was to be partly in Suffolk and partly in London, because I love London. And, you know, as you said earlier, this isn't a story of nature-starved Londoner flees for rural idyll. I'm still in love with London. I think it's a wonderful place, and I had a fantastically nature-rich life there. And so the plan was to live here, and then to carry on working. I used to work at Mixmag, which is a dance music magazine, and I was going to carry on working there. Unfortunately, the print magazine's been a victim of COVID, which is very sad. And so now, and of course, because of the pandemic, I've been here full time, and that's the bit that's changing my sense of who I am, because now I'm becoming a full-time country person. And I wasn't expecting that. I wanted to be in between. I'm somebody that's most comfortable on the edges of things. I'm not a belonger. I'm not a joiner of clubs or gangs or cliques or tribes. I'm somebody that likes to be on the edges, looking the foot in both camps, sitting on the fence. So I was going to be both, and I'm not at the moment. That's hard. Yeah. Not because I don't like Suffolk at all. I love it. But because it's not completely natural to me to be fully immersed anywhere.
I had noticed actually that you worked for many years, I believe, at Mixmag, because it's a music magazine, as you say, and I can't think of many things more urban than something like Mixmag. And of course, that teaches one something about how easy it is to pigeonhole people and so on and so forth. But can you just develop that thought a little bit, that idea moving between London and Suffolk and doing this different types of writing and so on?
Yeah, I found it hugely productive. You know, I started going to clubs when I was 18 and fell in love with dance music and nightlife and club culture, which is this incredibly creative, rich expression, rich culture that I think a lot of people, and particularly our current government, have little time for, because they have never experienced it, and they think that it's somehow lesser, and it's not. It's really incredibly precious. Obviously, I'm 45 now, so I'm not out on the dance floors every night in the way that I used to be. But I wasn't quite ready to retire. I still thought I had a little bit left in me, maybe. And I'm slightly worried that when we've all got the vaccine, there's going to be nothing left to go back to.
Yeah, sure.
But yes, you know, I think we do this. We say, oh, she's a nature person, or he's a I don't know, accountant. And then that we think that tells us something we need to know about somebody. And we've got this little picture in our heads of somebody, you know, in a suit with a briefcase, or in my case, I don't know, in a padded gilet with binoculars hung around my neck, and that's it. And that's not the case. There's loads of people in the nature writing world who are also into dance music. You know, what they've got in common is going out and standing in fields, you know. But I mean, you know, sort of joking aside, festival culture is full of nature people. So you know, there's huge overlap. You know, and sites like Caught by the River are the heart. That's the nexus. That's where all the tribes come together.
Yeah. I want to ask you about the relationship between nature and technology, which at first glance might seem sort of antithetical, but you talk about things like migrating birds as an example. When you spot them, you tweet about it and you're checking Twitter when people have seen things. You refer at something to websites that, you know, you're putting in data and people can get involved in data. Yeah. Can you talk, I mean, this is really, really interesting stuff, I thought. Can you just talk a little about the relationship between nature and technology?
Well, that's the other thing that we do, isn't it? We say we set up screens as a good thing and nature as a good thing. And you can go out into nature and do awful things that are just, you know, not healthy and not helpful at all. And you can go on your smartphone or tablet and do incredibly connected, wonderful, imaginative things. You know, you might see me walking around a nature reserve staring at my phone. What I might be doing is checking to see if a particular bird that I think I've just heard has been reported in that area. I might have been taking photos to put on, to use on the internet to describe what I've been doing. I might be making notes in an app for a book I'm going to write. I might be using a plant ID app. You know, I might be doing all sorts of things. And I think when we set up this opposition like that, we turn off a lot of young people.
Yeah.
You know, we're saying everything to do with your phone is bad and you're on your phone all the time, you're on your screen and you're playing games and that's all really, and then why are they going to want to listen to a word we say? I mean, I spend loads of time on social media. I'm on Twitter. I practically live there. You know, I'm never going to tell anyone they shouldn't be on their computer. And there's loads of really exciting ways into nature that exist in our lovely little black boxes. So I think we need to not bang that drum.
Yeah. I want to ask you a bit about how you think it might be too early to tell, how your writing might have evolved. I remember when I had the pleasure of talking to you about All Among the Barley a couple of years ago, something, as I recall, came up at the time was something to the effect that it was informed by your longing for the countryside. That had influenced your writing, if I'm recalling this correctly. Now that you are a couple of years, 3 years now in the countryside, do you have any sense that your writing is evolving? Or is that just too early to tell?
Well, I was slightly worried about that when I moved to Suffolk, because I thought, you know, when you write, when you long for something, there's a feeling of reaching. There's a feeling of imagined thing that you're reaching for, and that might be the past, or it might be the future, or it might be a place, it might be a feeling, and that definitely drove the writing of All Among Barley. And now I'm here, and I thought, am I still going to am I going to long for anything, you know, when I can walk out of my cottage and I'm surrounded by woods and fields? I do know what I'm going to write next, and I had an idea at the beginning of the year, and then the pandemic blew it out of the water, unfortunately. It became redundant. The idea didn't work anymore. But in literally the last few days, I know what it's going to be, and it's not going to be set in Suffolk, and it's not going to be set anywhere like Suffolk, and it's not going to be set in a city either. So there's going to be some distance, and I'm quite excited about it. I'm also afraid of it. Okay. And I think sometimes if you find something you don't want to write about or think about, if you can find a way to step towards it safely, that can be really productive.
Yeah.
That's what I'm going to do.
Okay. Well, I'm looking forward to this.
I'm not. I'm going to write it.
we're nearly out of time, but I just want one last thing, just talking about work you've been doing now. A little bird tells me you're due to publish 2 nature-themed children's books next year. Just in the few seconds we've got left, just tell us a little bit about that, something to look forward to.
They are based on the classic book for children, The Little Grey Men by B.B., which was published in 1942, and its follow-up, The Little Grey Men Go Down the Bright Stream, which my mother read to me and I loved. And they are up-to-date versions of those books, and they're nature writing for children. And when I was small, there was a huge amount of books set in nature for children that were part of how I imaginatively connected with it. And there really isn't much at the moment. And given that adult nature writing is booming, and given that we're all worrying about children's engagement with nature, where are the books that are going to help them do that? So I've written these 2, and they're called By Ash, Oak and Thorn and By Rowan and Yew. And they're both out next year. And I would like to urge anyone else who might have an idea of a book they can aim at children that's imaginative and emotional and engaged with nature. This is the time. Do it now. We need it.
Yes.
I want the competition.
Yeah. Yes. Look, I'm not quite sure where that last hour went.
No, me either. I feel like we've only just started.
Yeah. It's always a huge, huge pleasure to talk to you, Melissa. Thank you very much for being with us this evening.
Absolute pleasure.
Thank you again.
Thank you.